Let's go. Linhares, Carlos, vamos começar? Aí depois...
Professor, posso começar?
Sim.
Senhoras e senhores, bom dia. Convidamos a todos a ocuparem seus lugares. E vão algumas recomendações aqui de início do evento. Solicitamos a atenção de todos para que mantenham seus telefones celulares desligados ou em modo silencioso ao longo de todo o evento. Informamos que esse evento será híbrido, todo em inglês, com audiência também pelo YouTube. Podemos começar.
Good morning, everyone. I don't know if you are seeing my picture at this moment at the auditorium. Linhares, Carlos, would you please? Oh, that's it. So, hi everyone. My name is Tarcísio Fontainha. I am professor here at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I'm glad to open this seminar here today. So this is the first Ceped Coppe seminar with the title Project and Research Collaborations for Disaster and Humanitarian Operations across Brics countries. So Ceped, it's the acronym for the Center of Studies and Research of Engineering for Disasters. The acronym is based on the Portuguese version of that. So I would like to thank the presence of the speakers who are here with us, Nirmala Dorasamy from South Africa, Vipul Nakun from India, Shane Wonderwood from the USA, and also all the civil defense professionals from other organizations that deal with the disasters, all students, professors, and technicians from the university present here online and also in the auditorium at this moment. I would like to explain a little bit of the history of the Ceped. So since 2019, I have been supervising master dissertations and PhD theses and coordinating projects on disasters here at Coppe. The idea of creating the Ceped already came from that time, actually before that, but things were a little on hold with the COVID-19 pandemic. After this, on May 15, 2023, last year, we finally took the first step to formalize the constitution of Ceped Coppe. This means that we are completing the laboratory's first years of life. So this week, we are also strengthening our external communication by posting on social media. So we are posting on Instagram, Facebook. We also started posting on LinkedIn soon. Our website is under development right now and expected to go live in June. And to celebrate the Ceped Coppe's first year, I'm super happy to organize the first Ceped Coppe seminar today. So the seminar, it's organized in 4 presentations. Unfortunately, one of the presentations that we expected for today was canceled. Colonel de Campers had a family issue and he couldn't be with us today. And he would share the disaster management challenges from a local government perspective. So I will present an overview of the disaster management structure here in Brazil. So the first presentation will be focused on the research and projects developed by the Ceped Coppe. That's the laboratory that I'm leading now, and also the disaster management structure in Brazil. After that, we'll have the presentation from Nirmala Dorasamy from Durban University of Technology from South Africa, and she will present the disaster management in South Africa. After that, we'll have the presentation from Vipul Nakun from Gujarat International Finance Tech City from India. He will present the disaster management in India. And the fourth presentation will be made by Shane Underwood from the North Carolina State University in the USA. The presentation will cover climate change, disaster management, and transportation infrastructure. After that, we'll have a question and answers section. Marcos Montenegro will be guiding the questions and the answers by the speakers. And after that, we'll have a closure with final messages from all the speakers that are in the seminar today. So I'm going to share right now my screen so you can have my presentation here. So I hope that you are seeing my presentation right now at the auditorium and in the online on YouTube. As I said, I'm going to present first the research and projects developed by the Ceped Coppe. And after that, I will present the disaster management in Brazil, some perspectives of that. So Ceped Coppe, it's inside the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And Coppe means the Alberto Luiz Coimbra Institute for Graduate Students, Studies and Research in Engineering. Coppe is the Latin America's largest center for research and education in engineering. We have 13 engineering programs related to biomedical, civil engineering, electrical, mechanical, ocean, production engineering, transportation engineering. And as I said, Ceped, it's acronym for Centro de Estudos e Pesquisas de Engenharia para Desastres in Portuguese, and the translation is Center for Studies and Research of Engineering for Disasters. And the mission of Ceped Coppe is to develop, integrate, and implement different research and practical projects in the context of disaster and humanitarian aid with the participation of the Coppe's engineering programs. And the vision of the laboratory is to consolidate itself as a reference at the municipal, state, federal, and international levels in engineering actions through the disaster life cycle, which means the mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. I would like to present some of the research that we are developing in the lab. So I'm going to show a little bit of what we are developing in this specific PhD thesis. This first one that I'm presenting right now, focused on the refugees. So we have here the logo of the platform that we are developing. It's called Rede Refugia in Portuguese, which means a refugee network in English. And the idea of the platform is to integrate the refugees themselves in terms of support that they could offer and ask from each other. The idea started from my PhD thesis some years ago, where I identified that the literature in the disaster and humanitarian operations didn't consider the active role of the beneficiaries, the people that are affected by disaster. So based on this perspective that the people that are affected by disaster, they have an active role in the disaster response, in their own recovery. A specific research is developing this specific platform. The idea now is to work with the engagement of private sector in the refugee welcome process. And the idea is to build some models and propositions based on the stakeholder engagement, how we combine the effort from different stakeholders, from government stakeholders, from the private sector, as I mentioned, and humanitarian organizations. This specific research is being developed by systematic literature reviews, design science research, and design thinking methodology, as well as the grounded theory methodology. We have a first version of the platform already on live. The idea is to have uh, uh, another event to launch to disseminate the platform for the for humanitarian organizations and other stakeholders engaged in the refugee environment here in Brazil. We have the World Refugee Day on 20 June. So we are going to have the platform. This specific event will be held on some day before or after, close to the 20 June next month. So this is a very important platform, a very important project that we're developing, and is the first one that I would like to talk with you today. We are also developing another platform, a collaborative platform focused on the technologies for disaster and humanitarian operations. The second platform focuses on the collaborations from people that are owners of drones, and that and these volunteers they want to cooperate. They want to be part of the disaster response, the disaster mitigation. So the idea is uh, to have these specific volunteers that are drones owners and the civil defense that requires the use of drones to do monitoring in some risky areas or disaster affected areas. So we are developing this platform right now. The idea is to have a version to be presented to the civil defense by the end of this year. So maybe in November and December, we are that's our current deadline for the version to be launched. So in this specific PhD research, the researcher is applying a case study method, the design science research, and design thinking methodologies. Another PhD thesis that I would like to mention today, it's the combination of these two topics. The PhD combines the improvement of activation of Brazilian government stakeholders in the disaster response by a process approach. We are developing a business process analysis. So we have a specific researcher developing these process models. Here we have just a general representation of how these process models work. We have the as is, the current version of how the government stakeholders perform the disaster response in Brazil, and we have a proposition on the to-be version of this model. So the idea is to propose improvements for the Brazilian government stakeholders engaged in the disaster response. And we are also combining these with the perspective of stakeholders' engagement in the disaster and humanitarian operations. So we have a specific stakeholder model where that it was one of the results of my PhD thesis. This is from a specific paper that I published in 2017. And the idea is to show how the different stakeholders, they have to collaborate, they have to engage with each other, and to have the beneficiary as the focus of all the entire operation. There's also another research that we are developing in the Ceped that is focused on the insurance and other risk transfer mechanisms for natural disasters. We are developing these based on the perspective of a Brazilian scenario and the contributions to public awareness of the insurance for disasters. We have already performed systematic literature reviews and the case study. And after that, we're going to apply the design thinking method to create a specific course to raise public awareness on the topic. So here we have a specific framework that we are developing in this specific research. We combine concepts rooted in the disaster risk management and the insurance and reinsurance system focused on the Brazilian scenario. So we presented here some of the stakeholders, specific stakeholders in the insurance and reinsurance system. And we, of course, here is just a short version of the model in the paper that we're about to submit to an international journal. We explain all these relationships that we have here in this specific figure, in this specific model. We have also other PhD theses that are in different levels of development. So one of them is focused on the practical tools for managing disaster and humanitarian operations. In this specific research, the researcher is applying different research methods, systematic literature review, survey, design thinking, and grounded theory. We have also another PhD thesis that was just started some months ago. This specific thesis focuses on the community contingency plans, how to develop those plans with social engagement. The idea is to develop the thesis based on case studies and design thinking methodologies. And we have also another PhD thesis focused on the disasters impacts and countermeasure strategies on supply chains. This specific thesis applied the systematic literature review, survey, and structural equation modeling. And also another thesis focused on building public value based on governance arrangement for disaster and humanitarian operations, a legislative and regulatory perspective. The idea is to apply a systematic literature review and business process analysis or system dynamics. We are deciding right now. I would like also to mention and to present here some of master dissertations that we also have in Cepeds. So this one is focused on cyber incidents in cyber physical systems, a case study of the Brazilian electric sector. We applied the systematic literature review and a case study. And this specific dissertation, the most important thing in that is the fact that cyber attacks can affect and cause disasters in the real world. We have several examples of cyber attacks in water supply organizations, in electric sector. And if we have a specific failure in the system that supervise the operation of the water system in different countries, or the electric sector in different countries, that can cause consequences that are similar to disaster or specific disasters themselves. So some of the results in the specific master dissertations involves the identification on how the literature presents how to respond the cyber incidents. So we have approaches focused on linear perspective, on cyclic perspective, and linear with some feedbacks. So we have also other results. The idea here is just to present some of the general contributions that we have already identified in this specific research. We are also developing another research focused on the methodology for evaluating contingency plans, considering the perspective of the civil defense of Rio de Janeiro here in Brazil. And we are applying the systematic literature review, the design thinking, and also case study methodologies. And the idea here is based on the fact that several municipalities here in Brazil have already developed contingency plans. I'm going to present after this specific part the current situation of the disaster management in Brazil. And we have several developments in the last few years, and the civil defense of the different municipalities, they are almost developing contingency plans. We have several municipalities with contingency plans, but the problem is that the contingency plans, they are working on the paper, and they are not necessarily working in the reality. So when we have the disaster, the plans are not being considered or not being so quickly implemented. So the idea is to develop a methodology to evaluate those contingency plans, also considering the practical perspective of the implementation of the contingency plans. So whether or not they are having practical simulations, virtual simulations, all of that will also be considered in this specific methodology that we are developing. I would like also to comment two other master dissertations. We have one that it's another approach in terms of insurance, disaster insurance. The idea is to discuss how to combine government fundings for disaster insurance, and how to combine the insurance system, insurance reinsurance system, and how to simulate the values, the how much the population should pay, and how much the government should fund the insurance, in order to have a balance between the stakeholders, considering also especially the beneficiary, the people affected by disaster, as the one that are going to receive the premium of these specific insurance. So how could we combine all those stakeholders, and in terms of monetary perspective? So the idea is to develop a system dynamic model, and to simulate those relationships to identify the better combination of funding and payments from the population or other organizations that should reinforce this specific system. And the last one project and research that I would like to mention today focus on the stakeholder engagement in attending virtual simulations for evacuation of risk areas. So here in Brazil, we have the civil defense performing the evacuation simulation once a year in risk areas, and not all the population attend this specific real simulation. So the idea is to develop a virtual simulation that could be used in a combination with the real simulations. So we could reach a larger quantity of people living in risky areas, so they could be more aware of what to do when a siren is triggered, or when we have any signal of potential disaster. So the idea is to present and consider this specific virtual simulation accessible for the population, and as a tool that could be combined with the civil defense's operations in terms of the disaster management. So all of these are the main research PhD theses and master dissertations that we have being developed right now in Ceped Coppe. And I'm going to present quickly the disaster management in Brazil, some perspectives. So the first point that I would like to mention is a timeline of disasters and the creation of other Cepeds in Brazil. And we have a specific disaster in 2008 that triggered the development of the two first Cepeds that we have in Brazil, both in the same state. Here I put Rio Grande do Sul, but the correct is Santa Catarina state. And we have two specific Cepeds that were created after this specific disaster. We had the disaster in Região Serrana, in the mountains region of the Rio de Janeiro state in 2011. After that, we have it was developed a specific law to establish how the national system for the disaster management would be structured in Brazil. After that, we have some other Cepeds that were created. So we have another Ceped in Rio de Janeiro, but from another organization, another institution. We have also two others Cepeds from São Paulo universities, and also another Ceped created from in another university in Rio de Janeiro. So we had also the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, another disaster in the mountains region in the Rio de Janeiro state in 2022, and we had the creation of the Ceped Coppe last year, and now we are currently facing a disaster in Rio Grande do Sul that provoked floods, massive floods in the entire state. Just for you to have an idea, in 2008, we had 135 deaths, and the costs of the disaster response was around $1.5 billion US dollars. And this specific disaster right now, we have 147 deaths up to this point, and estimated cost of reconstruction of $16.7 billion. So we are having disasters right now that increased in terms of costs, increased in terms of deaths, in number of people affected. So here I would like to mention the importance of the Cepeds in Brazil. Those centers, they are very important for bridging the collaborations from the university with the civil defense and other organizations dealing with disasters in Brazil. So we have a national system for protection and civil defense. This specific national system consider the integration of civil protection state authority and national secretariat and civil protection city authority. So we have a decentralized structure of how to organize this specific national system. We have also different government levels. We have specific organizations at the federal level, at the state level, at city level that are the main responders and the main responsible for the disaster management. But also we have the civil society working with those stakeholders, also organizing at the federal, state, and city level of organizations. In terms of how specifically this national system work, we have the identification of a disaster risk. The university, for example, they could develop disaster risk analysis and perform those analyses in collaborations with the civil defense. And those disaster risk analysis and information from online monitoring of the weather monitoring, they could send some disaster risks for some federal agencies like Seminário. That's one that is responsible for monitoring weather-related events that could cause specific disasters in the entire country. And after that, those specific federal agencies, they can send a specific message for Senad, that is another federal organization that are responsible for receiving those alerts and to analyze whether or not to activate the states and cities civil defense. So here we have the specific follow of process follow, where Senad sends a specific indication for the states and civil defenses. All of these is controlled in a specific system for collecting information regarding disasters in Brazil. And after that, the Senad can also articulate the messages that are sent to the population. They could send messages through the cell phones from people that previously registered in the system, and they are also developing some new approaches of sending messages whether or not people have previously registered to receive those specific messages, because the idea is to consider that people should receive the message regarding potential disasters in the region that the people are in a specific moment. So they are working on that. And in terms of how we have those specific developments in Brazil, we have first national plan for the management of risks and responses to natural disasters with a massive budget. But this specific plan was developed after the disaster that we faced in 2011. We had also a specific law that was created in 2012, also after the same specific disaster in 2011. And we have also a combination of other centers monitoring disaster and being responsible for activating the civil defense at the states. And we now have the development of a national plan for protection and civil defense that consider risk scenarios for 2030 and for 2040. And these specific plans consider the definition of actions for civil protection and defense, with typical actions within legal competence of each entity or organization, with monitoring and evaluation of goals. The national system has several objectives, such as reduce disaster risks, provide aid and assistance to affected populations, recover areas affected by disaster, promote the identification and assessment of threats, of risks, to monitor events, meteorological, hydrological, geological, produce early warning alerts, and to promote disaster awareness campaigns. Just to conclude my presentation today, I just brought the Brazil's map with an indication of all the 27 capitals and a specific identification of places that Brazil, the national system, has a contract for the provision of response supplies in case of disasters. So here, for the disaster response in Rio Grande do Sul, the states that are facing massive floods right now, the specific supplier is located in Mato Grosso do Sul. That's another state. And we have several challenges in terms of how to promote a combination of contracts among the suppliers and how to select the suppliers and the definition of specific times, specific deadlines for the delivery of the supplies to the specific locations affected by disasters. Because one specific supplier, the problem that we identified some years ago was the fact that a supplier, one specific supplier won public bidding, and after winning this specific contract, the supplier didn't comply with the deadlines for delivering the supplies after disaster response, and they kind of calculated themselves how much they would be penalized in terms of some fines for not complying the specific deadlines for supplying the humanitarian disaster response kits, and how much they would pay for sending those specific kits. So the point is that the suppliers consider only the financial perspective on deciding whether or not they are going to attend in a disaster response, but it didn't consider the real necessity of the local affected area, because the local affected area was waiting for the supplies, whether or not it was something that the supplier would decide or to provide or not. So the point here is not to go that deeper in the problem, but showing that we have several problems in the national system. I just mentioned one of them that we identified in a specific research that we developed some years ago. And the national system has several other research and practical challenges that we are trying to contribute in a practical and in an effective way to the disaster response, to the disaster management in Brazil. So that's it from my part in this specific first presentation. And to continue the seminar today, I would like to invite Nirmala Dorazami from the Durban University of Technology from South Africa to make her presentation regarding the disaster management in South Africa. Considering the moment for Nirmala to set her presentation, I'm going to give a brief bio. So her research focuses on ethic and public sector management, with an emphasis on enhancing the effectiveness and the efficiency of public service delivery. Involved the creation of the Center for African Governance and Development, which would serve as a research hub for multidisciplinary research in Africa continent, which develops the monitoring and critical evaluation of relevant systems, policies, programs, projects, and protocols on the continent, regions and local levels uh, in the Africa in general. So, Nirmala.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning, Taxi. Unfortunately, I have to meet you virtually. But thank you for according me the opportunity. And the rest of the team, especially my dear professor here, who managed to introduce me to the various faculties in terms of the according me an opportunity to do various presentations. And also to our guest from India, Professor Vipal, thank you for coming on board and availing yourself for this presentation. We're just trying to get ourselves organized here. Marcus, am I going to use this? We need to project it. Just to give you a brief resume about where I come from. Okay, but is this? Yeah, but is it showing here?
Yeah, I'm just trying to pause your monitor on the screen.
Okay, I am South African by birth, Indian, of Indian descent from India. Here's my connection, Mr. Vipal or Professor Vipal. The university that I come from is the Durban University of Technology, which is in Durban, which is in the southern part of South Africa. Durban is one of the 9 provinces. A city in one of the 9 provinces in South Africa. The province will be the province of KwaZulu-Natal. KwaZulu-Natal is based along the coastline. We have access to some of the best beaches, the safaris and so forth. We have good weather. Very rare do we have any traces of snow, but generally very, very humid in summer, but manageable temperatures in winter as well. We are about to stream into winter, which starts around June. Not very, very cold, but manageable weather compared to the other provinces in South Africa. I am based in the Faculty of Management Sciences. The department is a Department of Public Management and Economics. I've been at the university for many, many years. I'm not going to give you the number of years because you're going to calculate my age. And I'm not going to disclose that. Just to get into the discussion, I'm going to give you a brief, if I could say a synopsis of the disaster management framework or the paradigm that is actually adopted in South Africa. Basically, I'm going to give you a rundown in terms of how we manage the process. And secondly, in terms of what are the constraints or limitations that mitigate the optimal responses in terms of disaster mitigation, recovery, responses, and so forth. Thank you, Marcus. You're a genius. Much appreciated. So I'm going to use this. Marcus, I'm going to use this. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Marcus. So just to give you a brief overview, I'm going to look at the policy coordination, the legal and institutional framework, and then I'm going to look at risk assessment and planning, and some of the challenges that we face in South Africa in terms of the optimal management of this particular aspect of governance, and then go on to the conclusion. Please pardon me, I am in the bad habit of speaking too fast. So I may be moving a bit too fast, but please excuse me or raise your hand and tell me I will not get offended that I'm speaking too fast. Okay, just like Taxi had indicated, we have adopted a very integrated approach in terms of disaster management. Having said that, we are actually guided by a Disaster Management Act of 2002. And this act is an all-encompassing act that actually guides the processes, the procedures, the policies, the statutory regulations in terms of who is responsible for what. Not only in terms of responding to a disaster, but also in terms of preventing the occurrences of disasters that could have been obviated or controlled or halted prior to it becoming beyond control. So apart from the disaster, the legislation, the Disaster Management Act of 2002, we also have what is called the National Disaster Management Center. Now, this center is nationally based and housed within the Department of Cooperative Affairs and Traditional Governance. Now, the Department of Cooperative Affairs and Traditional Governance is a national body, very similar to the situation in India and in Brazil. We have three spheres of government. We have the national, we have the provincial, and we have the municipal government. So these three spheres of government have decentralized or devolved responsibilities in terms of managing disasters. It's common knowledge that the best respondent to a disaster who be the individuals or the officials who are closest to the point of disaster. And that would be the municipality. So while we may have a national Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, and we have the National Center for Disaster Management housed in this national department, the decentralization of responsibility comes further into provincial and thereafter into municipality. Each one of them have disaster management plans, but there's a lot of coordination that goes into integrating the plans and the responses and the policies right from the national going down to the municipal level. But apart from formal governance structures, we have also adopted a more inclusive approach. And what would this encompass? Apart from the formal governance structures in terms of government spheres, we also have NGOs, we have businesses, we have CBOs that are all involved as potential stakeholders in engaging with the responsible government officials, not only in terms of responding when a disaster occurs, but also in terms of planning and making significant input in terms of developing disaster management plans. Now, in South Africa, apart from the PPPs, where we have the private-public partnerships that engage in a more inclusive approach to managing disasters, you find that other stakeholders like the businesses do come on board, as well as representatives from society. Now, in a democratic dispensation, participative governance is of critical importance. And here at the grassroots level, we have not only the communities, but also the councillors who are part of the municipality, who would engage with these communities to provide feedback into the municipalities when these plans are being reviewed or revised on an annual basis. So we have what is called IDPs, Integrated Development Plans, that not only refer to aspects like in terms of transportation, in terms of agriculture, in terms of rural development, but the IDPs also speak to what we call disaster management plans. So that is basically the coordination that takes place from the policy level, from the legislative level, and from the statutory level. But at the same time, it is not exclusive. It also engages with non-government officials and key stakeholders who have a potential interest in terms of contributing significantly to disasters in South Africa. Fortunately, if one looks at the geographical landscape of South Africa, we are not prone to incidences like volcano eruptions, lava eruptions. We have had, due to climate change, unusual developments in weather changes. For example, heavy winds, which we could possibly align to hurricanes, flooding, which has become quite regular in South Africa. But apart from the natural disasters, we have a lot of human-induced disasters. Apart from interfering with the environment in terms of deforestation and other aspects, interfering with the, let's say, thank you, with respect to water, the ocean operations, we also have a number of human-induced disasters. And what would this be? If I could give you a brief synopsis, last year around July, or it was the previous year, 2022, we had massive interracial tensions. Now, I'm not going to take you too much back into the apartheid regime, but those of you that have a brief knowledge, we have emerged since 1994 from a very discriminatory political system. The evidence of that discrimination, inequality, unfairness, unequal distribution of government resources, evidence of that is still pertinent up till this day. Despite the fact that we do have legislation, we do have frameworks that look at addressing or redressing the inequities that emanated from the apartheid era. But be it as it may, while we speak of affirmative action, while we speak about employment equity, while we speak about a quota system, while we speak of representativity in government structures, in businesses and so forth, racial tensions are still existent. And one of the effects of that was in 2022, we had major racial tensions that broke out in various areas that we call townships. Townships during the apartheid era were areas that were designated for specific race groups. I know yesterday, Matthias, the person that chaired the session, indicated that in Brazil you don't speak of races. In South Africa, we still, even though it is something that goes back to an era that we hoped it was in the back burner, but we still speak of what we call whites, coloreds, Indians, that's where I belong to, and the Africans, and they constitute the largest race group. But with those inequities that emerged from the apartheid era, we find that it has transferred into a democratic dispensation where there is the race on that gravy train to capture the most with the least effort. And these racial tensions have surfaced in numerous ways. In the workplace, it's very, very subtle. But if you're looking at in these townships, and because of greater encouragement of racial integration in places of residence, you find there was massive looting to the extent that it resulted in people actually killing each other across different races. But it was concentrated amongst the formerly disadvantaged groups. Now, that was actually an unforeseen disaster. It resulted in a number of people losing their lives, mass destruction to property. Now, therein, while the government forces came in, the South African Police Services, the SAPS, the SANDF, the South African National Defence Forces came in. And we have a very, very prominent NGO in South Africa, and they're quite globally involved. I don't know if any of you have heard of them, the Gift of the Givers. It has been a locally established NGO by a former medical practitioner. And they are quite involved in a number of these disasters, be it human-induced or natural disasters, in trying to resuscitate the damages that have been brought on board. So many of these human-induced disasters actually start like lightning. They would surface in an area and then suddenly get out of control, to the extent that security forces have to be brought in to try and prevent the destructive situation from becoming exponentially more destructive. So that is one. The other human-induced disaster that has traces over a good few years is genocide. South Africa, because of the bordering a number of African states like Mozambique and Nigeria, not a neighboring state, we have a major influx of individuals that are entering the country both illegally and legally. But whatever the measure, there is a problem with border control. And hence these individuals are coming into South Africa by whatever measures, jumping the borders, even the extent of bribery with the border officials, without passports, without visas, entering the country. And there starts a competition for labor. And because of the poverty that these individuals are placed in, and South Africa already being faced with high levels of poverty, there's a competition now for cheap labor. And obviously, with no resources and being a refugee or an illegal immigrant into the country, you find that individuals are sourcing labor from the cheapest resource, which would be the illegal migrants. We also have an influx of refugees, and here in itself it becomes a double blow because we are dealing with poverty, unemployment as an in-house problem, and the problem is being exacerbated by the influx of refugees. Our immigration policy speaks to humanitarian goals, and they would not denounce or prevent their entry into the country, and where resources can be provided, they will provide. But here again, it places a greater constraint on resources in terms of trying to address our in-house needs and trying to address the humanitarian needs of these individuals that are coming in as refugees or illegal immigrants into the country. So these are some of the issues that we are facing from a humanitarian perspective, as well as apart from the natural disasters in terms of, it was last year we had massive flooding where a number of beaches throughout South Africa were actually shut off because of the contamination. And tied to that is poor infrastructure, that when we have these natural disasters, it affects the infrastructure to such an extent that they become disabled in terms of properly functioning. And one of the side effects of that flooding was that the sewer systems, the sanitation systems, could no longer, if I could say, manage or withhold the thrust or the force of the floods to the extent that pipes burst and the sewer was flowing into the sea. The ocean was severely affected. People did not have access to the sea. It has an innumerable number of effects on other aspects, like tourism was affected. December is one of our key periods in terms of attracting tourists because of the summer vacation. And it actually led to a dwindling of the number of tourists that came into South Africa because of the closure of the beaches. And one of the cities most affected was Durban, because it attracts one of the most number of tourists during the summer vacation. Now, in terms of risk planning and assessment, as I told you, it is a decentralized approach. It is a very integrated approach, but it is comprehensive, and it requires coordination amongst a number of role players. But what are some of the methods that we would use in terms of disaster risk reduction, preparedness, mitigation, responses, and recovery? The first one that we look at is hazard mapping. Now, here in terms of hazard mapping, we look at how we can identify or be proactive in terms of looking at potential areas that now could become vulnerable to, let's say, landslides, that can become vulnerable to let's say, hypothetically heavy winds. In terms of the mapping, going back to the low-cost housing, in South Africa, it is a basic responsibility according to the Bill of Rights to provide housing. But due to the demand exceeding the supply, we have not been able to provide a basic need in terms of what we call low-cost housing. This is more for the individuals at the lower rungs of the income ladder. So what we've done is that we've established what is called informal housing sectors, where these houses are built not according to urban planning regulations. I've seen, I speak to Prof every morning when we're driving past the favelas. I promise you the favelas look more safe than the low-cost housing or the informal settlements in South Africa. They're basically built of poles, maybe tin, but no, if I could say, structural safety as per urban planning regulations. And when we have flooding or even very heavy winds, you find that most often the roofs or the actual structure collapses. It obviously results in a loss of lives, it results in the loss of housing, and other social effects that has a negative impact on families living in these informal settlements. They have generally a communal tap, one tap may be serving about 50 to 100 people. Often they have illegal electrical connections, and that in itself has caused a number of incidences of deaths where people have been electrocuted. And they also have communal sanitation facilities. So there's a lot of shared facilities, but from a quality perspective, addressing the basic human needs in terms of housing, health needs, and so forth, these have been compromised. So in terms of mapping, we use a GIS technology. Drones are actually used in terms of identify areas that are potentially exposed or susceptible to disasters that can emerge. Warnings are sent out via various social media platforms, but here again, if you're looking at infrastructure and development, you find that there is still a stark difference between the rural areas and the urban areas. In the rural areas, they may have roads, but not roads that are properly, let's say, constructed out of tar, that are usable during flooding or during heavy wind conditions. And also in terms of technology, we have students that come from the rural areas, and during COVID, our classes moved on to online classes. And we had provided data to the students to use when they went back to their homes. And most often, these students come from rural areas, but they could not access the online classes because of technological defects in terms of having access to proper connectivity. And some of them, it may sound ludicrous, who had to sit on trees and their rooftops to have access to connectivity so that they could engage in these online lectures. So here again, if they do not have proper connectivity in these areas, if these rural areas are low-lying, then there is going to be an issue of communicating with these individuals if there's an impending disaster. But there again, with climatic change and weather reporting systems, the question is, how accurate are they? We may very well have, I know there were numerous incidences lately where we have heavy downpours, and if you had to read the weather forecast, there was no indication that there was an imminent heavy downpour. So people are really not prepared, or the systems are not very accurate in terms of providing real accurate information. But nevertheless, as a mitigating mechanism, you find that various technological mechanisms are being used to try and be proactive, as well as to ensure that individuals and government officials are ready in terms of responding. Another method that's used in terms of identifying or using early warning system is historical data analysis. Now here they use what is called regressive analysis, where they would trace a trend or a pattern that's emerging in certain areas with regard to exposure or vulnerability to certain types of risk. For example, settlements that are close to rivers, and with excessive rains, it is more likely and quite often the case that those informal settlements, very often the areas that are most affected during heavy rainfalls are informal settlements, and often they are located near rivers because of access to sources of water, not necessarily for drinking, but for other consumption purposes. The other method that's used is vulnerability assessments. Now here we look at how vulnerable are these communities. A community can be exposed to a potential flood, but if you have the resources, then you would be able to respond appropriately. And here it becomes the facilities or the resources that you have between the rich and the poor. The poor often do not have the resources to mitigate or prevent or prepare adequately for such vulnerabilities. Whereas if you look at the well-resourced rich families, they can take proactive measures in terms of preparing for such floods, in terms of having sandbags, in terms of building adequate infrastructure like walls that are resistant to collapse and so forth. Another factor, another method is consultations, and here is the public participation measures that are used in terms of engaging. Very common in South Africa is what we call, I'm going to start talking fast because I just saw the 5 minutes. We have what is called imbizos. Now, imbizos are where the councillors who represent a particular community will meet often with the local communities to discuss aspects of need, areas of need. And when these disasters are imminent or have already occurred, then these meetings take place to look at what are some of the recovery measures that can be put in place in terms of assisting these communities on the road to recovery. And the other factor is a multi-hazard assessment, where we look at combined responses, combined hazards that can actually happen at a parallel pace. For example, where you would find a house that probably caught on fire due to lightning, and subsequent to that we had massive flooding. Now these vulnerabilities can happen in silos or they can happen simultaneously. Hence we have a multi-hazard assessment. We also have what is called, well, very common, I'm not going to go too much into that, into the impact of climate change and how it's affecting the country in terms of flooding, in terms of, to the extent in South Africa, for a period of time we had an unusual number of drownings where people just couldn't manage the excessive, harsh waves. And this was seen as a danger, a potential danger associated with change in oceanic conditions that was actually impacting on the stress placed on the waves that these even surfers and regular qualified swimmers could not manage swimming or surfing out in the sea. We also have what is called an analysis of the infrastructure in terms of the strength and its resistance to hazards, be it natural or human-induced. We also have simulation or risk modeling, where we look at simulating a particular disaster that we expect to take place and how we can best respond to it. In terms of the ecosystem, we know that they are not only peculiar to South Africa, there is a massive infiltration of human interference with the ecosystem to the extent that it is working to the detriment. And most of you would have heard the term Anthropocene. Now, the Anthropocene is actually a phenomenon that is evolving more commonly to show how human interference is having a debilitating effect on the environment. Yet, we are talking about disaster management, disaster responses, but we are the very ones that are actually contributing to those disasters in terms of trying to obviate that. I'm going to I'm really stuck, only have 1 minute. So what are the changes facing South Africa? resource constraints. As I gave you an example, we are fighting with limited resources, not only to address in-house problems, but from a humanitarian perspective to help those who are actually infiltrating into the country either by legal or illegal means. We have institutional capacity constraints as well in terms of the lack of skills, competencies, and capabilities in terms of adequate training, adequate skills regarding responding from a disaster management perspective. Also the socio-economic inequalities, as I told you, if you have the resources, you're well off, you're rich, you would be able to better respond on your own as an individual to these disasters. Very quickly, at the hotel, I saw a number of families that were being housed at the hotel because of the floods. And what was interesting, and I did share it with Prof, that they are being paid, or the cost of staying in the hotel is being paid by the municipality, or it's government funded. This is unheard of in South Africa. You either have the resources, if you are so-called financially capacitated, to provide alternate accommodation. If you do not have the resources, we often provide makeshift tents, community centers and so forth, where these individuals can be helped or housed to live in these temporary abodes till adequate housing can be found for them. Also, if you're looking at the migration tendencies, we have a great influx of people from the rural to the urban areas because of the pull factors in the urban areas. But are we adequately planning in terms of providing adequate housing and resources in the urban areas? The answer is no, because the demand is exceeding the supply in terms of government resources to provide what is needed in the urban areas. And also climate impact, I'm not going to repeat that, and environmental degradation, deforestation, soil erosion and so forth. We do not really. While we are dealing with the human aspect, the environment aspect becomes another challenge. And how do we prioritize the dissemination of resources to address varying needs? And also the issue of awareness. Are people adequately aware of what are disasters? Are they prepared? Is there knowledge dissemination in terms of preparing people, or are we preparing them only at the time that the destruction takes place? It has to be a continuous process, but if this is taking place continuously on an ad hoc basis, becomes highly questionable. Also, we are faced with a number of humanitarian crisis situations that requires a great injection of financial resources, and as we know, public resources are always constrained. And one of the factors attached to those restrained public resources is pilfering or stealing or corruption that is taking the resources away from where it is most needed. Sorry, the speed was fast. I hope I managed to get across what I needed to. Thank you for bearing with me, timekeeper. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirmala. It was amazing to hear your presentation, the challenges and the problems that you mentioned in South Africa. Some of them are quite similar that we're facing in Brazil. Some others have some particularities, specifically from the African continent and South Africa. But I have had several ideas of how to comment, how to collaborate with you. I took some notes here, and I hope that we could discuss more in the future. And of course, we are going to discuss in the end of the seminar also today. I would like to reinforce to the online audience that you could write your questions in the YouTube chat, and we will have a question and answer section at the end of the seminar. So we are going to present your questions. So please write in the chat. And now we are going to move to the second presentation, focus on the disaster management in India. The presentation will be performed by Vipul Napun from the Gujarat International Finance Tech City in India. He leads the disaster management department of the Gujarat International Finance Tech City in India. His doctoral research at Pandit Dayal Energy University in Gaundhinagar in India is focused on the integration of disaster risk management and social entrepreneurship. He is trained in disaster management from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and has over a decade of experience in this field. He was awarded the CDRI Fellowship in 2021 to 2022 from the Coalition of Disaster Resilient Infrastructure for conducting innovative research on the risk-informed school evaluation tool. So, Vipul, thank you very much for accepting the invitation to presenting here in the first Ceped Coppe seminar. So now the work is on you.
Thank you so much, sir, for the detailed introduction. Before I start, let me share my screen. I hope this is visible. The screen is visible.
Yeah.
So
you can go.
Okay, thank you so much, sir, for confirming. And hello, everyone. Greetings from India, and thank you so much for providing me this opportunity to connect with you all, participate in this seminar, and share some of the findings of our research that we are doing at the university. So I would like to start my presentation with the quote that uh, hazards can be natural, but most disasters are human-made, right? And you will definitely agree with me on this particular thing. And why it is so? Because we are somewhere failing in implementing our policies and practices with due consideration of disaster risk management. And when we are failing, we are turning those hazards into disasters. So now this is widely accepted that there is no concept of natural disasters. It is the natural hazards, and we are converting those hazards into disasters, right? So with this particular thing in our mind, we started our research with the three basic objectives, considering these objectives. First objective was to examine what is the institutional and framework or institutional mechanism for disaster management in India. And we also tried to see the overall framework of disaster management in other 9 countries as well, right? Our second objective was to examine whether uh, these frameworks, the existing frameworks, are adequate to respond to multi-disaster situations. Right? Uh, we learned a lot from our past disasters, and most of those disasters were single in occurrence. Right? So we prepared accordingly, but there are some situations where we faced dual disaster scenarios. So what went wrong in responding to those scenarios, or what we gaps occurred in overall system. And our third objective was, if we fail, then develop a holistic framework examining the local level initiatives and approaches, and study the best practices where they have actually done good in managing this dual disaster scenario. So starting with the overall profile of India, if you name the disaster, and you will find it in India. So this is the fact, right? So India has a wide geography, and now we are number one demographically, right? So it is overall divided into 28 states, and these states have a distinct geographical locations. So starting from the north, the India is having a mountain range, Himalaya mountains. So if you study the Himalaya mountain, it is prone to earthquakes, landslides, floods, glacial outburst. Risk of glacial outburst is there, and avalanches. And after those Himalayan range, there is the Gangetic and Brahmaputra plains, right? River plains. So these blue lines, if you see, it is floods, right? So it is prone to floods. Coming down to further below, this red area, it is the drought-prone region, right? Complete barren land, mainly desert, and it is mostly prone to droughts. And further you go down, you will see that the plateau areas again prone to droughts and heat waves, right? The current, like today, if you see the temperature of this region, it is going beyond 45 degree, and we are experiencing severe heat waves outside right now, right? So it is almost 7 o'clock in India, but if you see the temperature outside, it still feels like 45 degree outside, right? And further down, it is covered by ocean from three sides, and this entire coastal region is prone to cyclones, even tsunami, and coastal erosion. So India has a diverse geography where one at a one particular time, one area is prone to drought and one area is experiencing extensive floods. So this is the situation, right? And we, like Professor has rightly mentioned out in previous presentations, that there is a journey of all the countries, how they have evolved in disaster management, they evolved their disaster management frameworks. And we actually learn from disasters itself, right? So similarly, if you see, we had a earthquake, Latur, called as Latur earthquake in 1993, where the the earth, the earthquake hit area was previously, uh, we called it as no earthquake zone, earthquake zone zero, right? But then we learned that, oh, there is no concept of earthquake zone zero. Each and every place on this earth is prone to earthquakes of severe nature may be different, right? So we learned from that. Then there was a super cyclone in one of the state called as Odisha. Then we actually thought that there is a need to study different frameworks around the world and establish our framework as well. So we, in 1999, we constituted a high power committee who studied different frameworks, and by that time we also hit by an earthquake in Gujarat, in the state where I am currently sitting, right? So, and then before the national government even think of having a national level framework, the state, or you can call it a province, thought of having a province level disaster management act, right? And that act was then, within 3 years we also hit by a tsunami, and that was, I think, a first of its kind. And India realized that a tsunami can also be hit in the country, right? And then we seriously thought of having a national level framework, and we got our National Disaster Management Act in 2005. And then other disasters also proceeded, like Kosi floods. That was the first of its kind where entire province got affected by flood. So that was of that particular nature, right? And then Uttarakhand flood again, in 2013. That flood was due to glacial outburst, like glacial lake outburst. So also then we started thinking of GLOF. And then after several disasters uh, followed those particular disasters. But by then, we had some mechanism in place which helped us in minimizing the overall impact on the people, on the community, on environment, and on property at large. So that was the act who brought a paradigm shift, right? We started thinking on not only just response entry but also proactive measures. Uh, it the entire measure was backed by the institutional framework and the legal authority, and it was supported by financial mechanism, right? So we created some funding mechanism: National Disaster Response Fund, National Disaster Mitigation Fund, state level. At province level we have State Disaster Response Fund, State Disaster Mitigation Fund, right? So this particular act actually laid down the system, the hierarchy, as the professors also discussed earlier, from national to province to district to local level. So this is the overall framework. You can see in similar to other countries, Ministry of Home Affairs is the nodal ministry for who looks after disaster management in the country, and it also have three other institutions. One is National Disaster Management Authority, National Institute of Disaster Management, and a national level disaster response force. So currently, India have 12 disaster response force, dedicated teams, dedicated resources, high-level super specialty resources are with them, and they are strategically located in different parts of the country, right? And then coming up to the state level, so there is a state level mechanism placed in all the provinces of India, and we call it as state disaster management authorities. And further going down, there is a district administration, right? District administration are also covered with local rural areas. We call it a panchayat at village, and municipalities and municipal corporation in urban areas, where we have district disaster management authorities, right? And powers are duly given to the highest authorities of that particular level, such as National Disaster Management Authority is directly looked after by the Prime Minister, right? And State Disaster Management Authority directly looked after by the Chief Minister, and District Disaster Management Authority is directly headed by the district collector or district magistrate. So parallelly, in recently our National Disaster Management Plan in 2019, it got revised, and it is one of the first plan which at national level plan which is in line with Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So it basically calls for having like integrating all four priorities of Sendai framework, starting with understanding risk, where entire risk profile has been lined up. Then interagency coordination, investing in disaster risk reduction, both in terms of structural measures and non-structural measures, and it also discuss about capacity development at all different levels, and it also have it also covers other aspects and guides other aspects of having similar plan at, like if it is a province, then state disaster management plan; if it is a district, then district disaster management plan; if it is a city, then city disaster management plan, right? So similar planning processes are there, and it also guides of having this particular mitigation measures at each level. So after like looking through the all these institutional mechanism that we are having, starting from the national to state to district to local level, we try to find out like uh, are these framework are actually practically functional during this multi-disaster scenario. So during this period of COVID-19 pandemic, one thing was like entire machinery, the state level machinery, district level machinery, they were involved in pandemic response. And at the same time, you can see the different cyclone Amphan, Nisarg, Yas, Taukte, Gulab. Right? These cyclones hit India from the different directions. So one, West Bengal and Odisha is on the west coast, east coast, Maharashtra in the west coast, West Bengal and Odisha again, Maharashtra and Gujarat on the west coast, Andhra Pradesh in the south coast. Like if you see entire country, different parts hit by cyclones on the same time, right? So what it demanded, right? In India now, the one thing we usually do whenever we receive an early warning for cyclones is we evacuate the people, right? In recent cyclones, uh, the fatality of human beings were minimal, or almost you can say zero. So we have cyclone shelters along the entire coastline. We also immediately so we have list of identified shelter points like schools, community halls in different villages, in higher grounds. So we immediately evacuate the people. So there was a large scale evacuation required during this time, and adhering to the COVID-19 protocol was very crucial. So neither the community nor the response agencies were able to adhere to the COVID-19 protocol. And most of the cyclone shelters, their capacities got reduced by almost 50%. And there was a challenge for government to add other shelter points to, to facilitate all the people evacuated during that time. So this was the major challenge. And to just quote one of the example which I personally like evaluated during my research journey with the uh, rapid action force. There is a state level rapid action force who told us that all the rapid action force, all the members of the rapid action force got down or quarantined within 1 week of the cyclone response in during the Amphan cyclone in Odisha. Why? Because they were not prepared. Like there was a period of 14 days. People can be again in the good state after getting affected, but they didn't plan that way. Entire team went to the response, and they all got quarantined. In the next week, there was no response, right? So they faced all the teams faced the similar problem during the COVID-19 pandemic. So what can be done? So we tried to figure out from few recommendations and try to develop an integrated model from that particular learning, and we tried to see that how can we prepare, how can we respond to this particular dual disaster scenario, right? So first, just let us talk about the response part, right? So if we hit by a dual disaster scenario, then we need to see that the existing resources will not work, right? It will definitely go insufficient. Then we will need to see which type of disasters are these. These two disasters are like which type and which kind of resources we will require. Maybe we require distinct shelter points, isolation areas at that time as well. And we will also need to see like to leave no one behind. That concept should also be in our mind while planning for the response. In long-term reconstruction rehabilitation, like we will need to see our infrastructure services are sustainable, right? Building back better concept is there, and holistic rehabilitation. But again, need to see how we can do that recovery to bring us better back to the normalcy, considering this both the scenario, dual disaster scenario. Again, if we consider the preparedness, then definitely this is a challenge to analyze the double disaster scenario, because those both will have a differential impact, though both will have a different systemic challenges, and both will need a different kind of resources and response teams, right? So that is again a challenge. So we will need to analyze both the scenarios very, very carefully, and then our interdepartmental coordination is also very much important. I will discuss again in detail in the next slide how interdepartmental coordination works at local level. During this COVID-19 pandemic, our existing plans, whether it is a district disaster management plan, city disaster management plan, uh, state disaster management plan, they had either very, very limited or no inclusion of pandemic at all. Or definitely they were never thought of having a chapter on such a pandemic or COVID-19 pandemic at all. Then they started updating it, developing different SOPs on how to include those particular chapters in the existing disaster risk management plan. They are some of the districts and states are still doing this in the upcoming revisions. And again, considering the dual disaster scenario, we need to see how we are connecting to the last mile through our communication network, carrying out structural and non-structural mitigation measures, considering both multi-disaster resilient features. And one of the example I can give is having a cyclone shelter in a earthquake-prone region, right? There are so many locations in India which are coming under earthquake zone 5, such as Kutch region in Gujarat, which hit by earthquake in 2001, and the same location is equally prone to cyclones, right? So their structures are, and definitely these cyclone shelters are structured in such a way that it can withstand earthquake as well as cyclones at the same time, right? So this is very important. And again, community level capacity building and training on multi-disaster response, because our, like, we had our teams ready to respond to cyclones, but those teams, we found that they cannot run wearing PPE kits, right? So PPE kits are very fragile, and only people like doctors or nurses or people in general can wear it. But the responder, like the response team who is going to run in the field, who is going to take equipments, who is going to evacuate the people, right? They cannot use PPE kits or either masks, right? So that was again a challenge that faced by the thing. Another recommendation, like having this approach that was given to each and every officer in Odisha during the cyclone Amphan, to have a zero casualty approach, right? And this approach was followed by each and every officer that prioritize each and every individual during the response, like evacuate children first, evacuate each and every pregnant ladies first, evacuate elderlies first, and no and leave no one behind. So this approach actually worked, and during Amphan, the casualty was almost zero in each and every affected area, right? So this is how they actually work. So at very local level, below the districts, there are blocks in India. We call it block development officer. And during and under the block development officer, he is in charge of several other officers as well, right? We have tehsildar at even below level, and other parallel systems like people in other departments like agriculture department, horticulture department, veterinary department, irrigation department, water, medical officers, and very local level we have Anganwadi. It is a early child care centers, right, run by government, and parallelly other response teams such as fire brigade, police, the civil defense and home guard are also part of it. Community and primary health centers, right? And other are the volunteers from the community who are community leaders, right? So this team actually works in a very coordinated way, and they try to see how they can achieve a zero casualty approach. So each and everyone, they took ownership of their activities, and they tried to see how collaboratively, irrespective of their roles or their departments in different parts or different approaches, they work very closely and collaboratively to achieve zero casualty approach. Next thing we suggested and we found it very relevant is like strengthening the disaster response forces. So in India, as I mentioned earlier, we have national level team, National Disaster Response Force, and we have a specialized state disaster response forces as well. Other than this, there is a other teams, fire brigade, police, health, like, and other voluntary teams like civil defense, home guards, national cadet corps, national services, Nehru Yuva Kendra, and such teams are there. So we need to train them on dual disaster scenario. And very recently, uh, we have also started one, like India, states and national authorities have also started one program. It is called as Apda Mitra, right? This is a trained community volunteer group, and there is a mandate given by government that you have to identify and train 100 volunteers in the area which is having a population of around 5 lakh. You will need to train 100 volunteer in that particular area and equip them with the disaster response kit and insurance for 3 years, so that they can actually go and help people or respond to any disasters, and their lives are also covered by the insurance. So this is again a good initiative. This is the last recommendation that is very important. We cannot work in silos, right? So we are having different teams working on sustainable development goals, disaster management, and climate change adaptation, right? And how can we, and it is very important to improve national and local level planning uh, uh, to integrate these three aspects. And our aim is to achieve all the targets in all three schemes by 2030. Right. So one thing can be done, and India is doing, is we are having several centrally sponsored schemes or national level flagship program that are by the initial phase only. They are trying to integrate and mainstream disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation measures and principles in the policy framework. And definitely it is very important to take a local knowledge and local awareness uh, from the local people and implement those local actions, like, because it is very important in the country like India, because each and every geography is distinct, languages are distinct, culture are distinct, so we cannot superimpose one particular act on at another level or another location. So this is again very important, and as a part of my research, I have been trying to see what are these key local actions and how it took advantage of disasters that happened in that particular area, and how they trying to help build community resilience. So this is the overall research findings that we had during our in this particular paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vipul. It was amazing to see how things work in India. You brought several perspectives of a historical way of how laws and plans are developed in India, and it's similar how things work here in Brazil as well. We have the national level a responsive approach of changing or implementing laws, revising national plans after huge disasters, and you posed several recommendations that are very hard to implement, but very necessary. I agree with all of them. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I'm very happy that we have you here. And moving now to the next presentation, I invite Shane Underwood to make his presentation. Shane Underwood, it's from North Carolina State University in the USA. His research and education program focuses on material and their interaction with society and the natural and the built environments. His interests focus on research, education, and service activities that evaluate, inform, and shape the science of these interactions, particularly how materials decision influence the use, function, and impact of civil infrastructure. So Shane Underwood, thank you very much. I believe that you are going to talk a little bit about climate change, disaster management, and transportation infrastructure. Now we go to the auditorium again.
Bom dia. Okay, that's about the extent of my Portuguese. All right, thank you very much. I work in the area of transportation engineering and pavements, and so it's really important to make sure everyone is awake at the beginning of the talk, because it's not the most exciting field. It's exciting to me, but not to everyone else. What I'm going to talk about today, it's really been enjoyable listening to the other speakers. They're talking about things that are a bit different than what I'll talk about. Really focusing on this issue of disaster management, and I'm going to take a different stance on that a little bit, or just give a different perspective from my background. As we've all been talking about, the issue at hand that we have here today and in today's talks is really about extreme weather and how extreme weather affects our built environment and therefore people's lives and everything. And I'm going to focus a lot on transportation, because I think transportation is a critical link to recovery. It's a critical link to mobility, economic development, and other factors. And extreme weather, I know there's been some talk about COVID-19 and other anthropogenic effects. I'm really going to focus on natural effects or natural hazards. And that can take on a lot of different patterns. We've talked a lot about floods. I think here in Brazil, the most immediate concern is with flooding, but there are, of course, droughts, wildfires, and many other ways that the natural environment intersects with our transportation infrastructure. And that's really what I want to talk about today. So I've got 3 points. I want to talk about climate change and how climate change affects our transportation assets, and by extension affects mobility and the ability to respond and the performance of our built environment during natural disasters or natural hazards. And I want to kind of frame that in three considerations for you to think about. Now, the basic idea of this talk, when we talk about disaster management, I'm going to draw a strong link between disaster management and asset management, because I think preparedness for events and responses during events with respect to our transportation assets is a critical piece of disaster. It's also something I can speak to. I can't speak to the myriad of complex issues that our previous speakers have talked to. I'm fortunate, I feel like, to deal with a complicated problem and not a complex problem. Although addressing that certainly helps to address some of the issues that the other speakers have brought up. So I'm going to talk about management in terms of asset management and how that might be a mitigating factor for managing disasters as well. And I'm going to frame that in terms of time horizons, because when we manage our assets, as the previous speaker talked about recovery in terms of time, I'm going to talk about management in terms of time, and then wrap up with a brief summary statement. So I want to start with these three considerations for climate change. So consideration one, the first is that we have to think about what critical variables do we consider out of the myriad of potential climate variables that affect our infrastructure. Two are the probably obvious and most important, temperature and precipitation. And these two affect directly and indirectly our transportation assets. I'll show you some examples as we go through here. But we also have these effects of climate change in terms of temporal variation. Long-term effects, these are overarching trends related to steady increases in temperature, which you see here in the upper left part of the graph. This graph is simply showing us that temperature is increasing with time, and we don't need the data to show us that. We feel this in terms of our daily lives. But we also have changes in long-term precipitation patterns that affect transportation infrastructure. Engineers, if not knowing the entire audience, when we sit down to design something, a pipe, a road, we have to take considerations of climate. And one of the things that we often look at is, what does the precipitation history look like over time? And the map at the bottom shows you in green and red hues areas where the historical precipitation patterns are lower or higher than our current precipitation expectations. And so these trends are very much a long-term effect. But we also have what I've labeled here as short-term impacts from climate change. And this is really when we're talking about these extreme events, like we're seeing in southern Brazil today, in these days, which are extreme precipitations that can inundate and flood our pavements. We also see the counter of that, which is extreme drought, which we've experienced in the western parts of the United States and many other parts of the world in recent decades, which affect the foundation materials and have indirect effects on our transportation assets. And we also have things like heat waves, which can create temporarily short but extreme temperatures that affect our transportation infrastructure. Pavements and materials in the pavement are temporally sensitive, and we see that in terms of blow-ups or even buckling of our transportation assets. So that's consideration number one, thinking about what are the variables and how they act over different time scales. Now, the second consideration is with respect to the nature of impacts on our transportation infrastructure. This is a diagram that was put together by a PhD student working with myself and another faculty member, principally with the other faculty member at Arizona State, which tried to categorize these impacts in two dimensions, physical impacts and non-physical impacts, and then direct and indirect influences. And as engineers, we often, because of the visual observations, focus on these direct physical impacts. When there is climate change, which affects an extreme event, and that extreme event washes away a road, we clearly see the direct and physical implications of the climate change effects. The same way with steady temperature increases. But there are other effects that are often missed. For example, changes in temperature patterns affect insect movement. Insect movement affects vegetation. Vegetation affects stability of roadsides. There are numerous ways, some of which are recognized, many of which are not recognized, that our transportation assets are affected by climate change. Another way that assets can be affected in an indirect or in a non-physical but direct way has to do with heat. As temperatures increase, we see people moving from active modes of transportation to vehicles or cars that have climate control. And in that way, we are affecting our transportation assets. We're affecting the capability and the capacity of those assets to absorb more movements and so on. We also have indirect impacts. Transportation is highly tied to power systems. It's highly tied, and in an increasing way, to internet connectivity systems, which promote some potential pathways for cyber-based impacts to infrastructure. So as power systems become less stable under increased heat or under increased, I believe in Brazil, a major source of power is through hydroelectric power generation. I was at a talk from a colleague who studied these in Brazil and was talking about how river flows have affected power generation capabilities. Right? This is an indirect influence of climate change, which can cascade into our transportation assets. Okay? And so the second consideration to think about is, and I'm going to focus, by the way, today a lot on direct physical impacts, but this is only one quadrant of the way that climate change can affect us, and things to be thinking about if we're looking at mitigating or managing the consequences of those. The third consideration I want to put forward is management, and management occurring at different timescales. This was, I think, spoken to in a different context with the previous speaker from India, who showed a circular diagram about how disaster management happens at timescales. Asset management happens at different timescales as well, and it requires sort of recognition that there are acute issues that have to be managed. When a road is flooded and it washes out, we need to fix it, or we need to decide what to do about that very quickly. Sort of that human response aspect, getting people's lives back in order, getting resources to affected communities, getting health care to affected communities. These are part of that acute management stage. But short-term, medium-term, and strategic management are all about preparation. How do we actually have and have positive contributions to disaster recovery and plan for that many years in advance? And so what I want to do with sort of the rest of the presentation is talk about some examples of where management at these scales come into play. So I'll start with acute management. And acute management is really about managing during the disaster. How do we manage the infrastructure during the disaster? And this process is quite complicated, or in fact I would call it complex on the basis of the previous discussions, because these management activities are being undertaken at a time when the agency, in the United States that would be managed at the state level, is trying to ensure the movement of normal civilian activities. So they're trying to make sure the infrastructure is working while people are being evacuated, while people are being fed, housed, and all of those issues, and while thinking in a little bit of a forward thought about how do we recover from this? How do we position our acute management to facilitate recovery? So there are a lot of pieces to acute management. Some of them are foresights, recognizing that supplies, equipment, materials need to be positioned strategically before an event comes, in order to make them viable for repair work that can be undertaken. And that requires, again, good forecasts of where hazards are going to occur. But the kinds of things that have to be managed, it's scales. I don't know that without seeing sort of what happens to our infrastructure after events, it's easy to appreciate that there's a spectrum of impacts from disasters, or from, I'm going to focus specifically on flooding. We have a range. At one end of the extreme, we have roads that are completely lost, impassable, and unusable. That's what you see in the upper left-hand picture here, and in part in the middle of that photograph. But we also have damage that occurs that is important to fix, but doesn't affect the overall mobility of the roadway. And as an agency, they're looking at hundreds, or even in the case of my state during a recent event, thousands of failure locations that look like one or more of these photographs that you see in the image here. And so there's a prioritization that needs to go on with respect to which facilities need to be repaired immediately, which they can triage and put off for weeks or months in the future, and which ones, again, are going to be, even the ones that are critical to repair, which of those is really the one that they're going to do first. And that requires a lot of coordination, not only among the State Department of Transportation, but among the disaster recovery groups, and a lot of the complex issues that the other speakers have talked about feed into the prioritization of this. There's also a matter of personnel and who will go about doing the repairs. In our state, and I think it's very common across the U.S., these are specialized repairs that require highly trained personnel to do. And so there's a limited number of those due to a number of complex issues that may or may not be available. There are also prioritization on co-located systems. In the image in the center here, you'll notice that the road is washed away, but you'll also notice there are two pipes that are in that picture. These pipes are going to be managed by a different set of people. These are going to be managed by the water distribution system industries or the institutions. And so an agency wanting to repair the road would need to make sure that those other institutions are making proper allowances and proper preparation before the event as well. And that kind of interinstitutional issue can make major issues for the agency. Now, I show you these impacts, but I also use this as an opportunity to say that when a disaster hits, or excuse me, I want to try to use the correct term, when a natural hazard intersects with our transportation infrastructure, it's also an opportunity to learn. One of the major hallmarks of making resilient systems is not only understanding what the impacts might be, taking steps to adapt, but also making sure to learn from the failures that exist. And so one of the things that our local agencies have done is they have an extensive program of documenting where failures happen and the nature of those failures and the repairs that were taking place. Okay, and so all of these photos that you see were taken as part of that documentation process. And where that becomes important is because when subsequent events hit, we can see what kind of damage happened in a first event, what kind of repairs were put in place after that event, and then how effective those are. Okay, so I give you one example. This is from, again, my state. We had the unfortunate consequence or sequence of events in 2016 and 2018. Our state was hit by two hurricanes in those 2-year sequence. And both were what we consider to be 500-year events, so major hurricanes on large portions of eastern North Carolina. And what the state was able to do with that was observe what kinds of repair options were made after one event and which of those were actually effective at mitigating damage. Okay? And if we think about it as a disaster recovery perspective, what makes an asset less vulnerable or less damaged during events certainly helps with that recovery. And one of the things that they noticed through doing that work was that their design standards were woefully inadequate. We learned through this that even though we have very dedicated and complex and complicated design standards, on some small volume roads, engineers exercise their judgment. Sometimes our assets are 100 years old or older, especially on the eastern part of the U.S., where we've had significant development over many, many decades. And so this table essentially gives you a sense of that. The numbers in the table show us the area. So this is really, really simple. This is a pipe under a road, and this is the area of that pipe. And these happen to be in square inches. I apologize for my use of the non-metric system. You don't need to know what the numbers really mean, except when you compare the first column to the second column, you'll notice the second column numbers are all bigger by a pretty substantial margin. And this is because the agency understood and learned that their design standards from the past were creating woefully undersized pipes. And that seems pretty simple, but from from an impact of a natural disaster, it's actually pretty important to recognize. This speaks to some of the longer-term management that I'll talk about in a moment. The state also learns some strategies. Now, this is just one example about what kinds of assets to leverage, what kinds of strategies to use in order to prevent future damage in subsequent storms. And so this is just one example of a pipe. It has a head wall, that metal head wall, and then hardened side slopes to try to prevent erosion and future damage to that site. But by leveraging the data that they collected, they create an objective, evidence-based data set from which to make their management decisions in the longer term. Now, management decisions after the event, speaking to the previous speaker who talked in one block about reconstruction, and he showed this sort of circular diagram with manage the hazard, manage the event, and then reconstruct, and then that led into longer-term management. But that reconstruction can take actually a long time. It actually covers a fairly long period. And so we need to think about what do we do in the short term and medium term. And short term here is, okay, the event is over. What are we going to do in the next 3 to 5 years to repair things? Or what are we going to do in the next 10 years in terms of medium term? And the kinds of things that show up like this are these images. So this is, again, in my home state. This happens to be an interstate, a very large volume road. And you can see the inundation that has happened following the second of those 500-year events I was talking about. Now, in this case, there ends up being no obvious damage. From an acute recovery period, we're simply waiting for the waters to recede. And there's nothing that an engineer or a human can do to make the water recede any sooner than it's going to. But once that water is receded, there's no reason that that pathway or that road cannot be passable and can't be used. But there is a long-term impact here. That soil, roads work by reinforcing the soil and providing a strong, non-erodible foundation to drive on. But when floods like this happen, the soil is inundated underneath. It's weakened. Because of that weakened soil, these roads will deteriorate at a more rapid pace, or there's a possibility that they deteriorate at a more rapid pace. And that has practical implications from a mobility standpoint, because repairs will be needed at a later date. There can also be inequity issues, because many times roadways in the U.S. in rural, underrepresented communities are built in these sort of flood areas. This is where people have tended to migrate. There's a lot of farming communities in these areas. And so we need to understand what the implications of flooding like this would be on the long-term performance. And so to do that, it takes a lot of preparation. We need to understand how pavements are deteriorating anyway by natural process. We have to understand that deterioration pathway is highly uncertain. We're dealing with an engineered structure, but there's a lot of uncertainty inherent in that engineering to that structure. And so here's an example where that flooded section was evaluated for performance several years after the event. The curve in the middle shows what we would expect the deterioration to look like. And as you can see with that shaded blue area, we have a lot of uncertainty about what that deterioration is going to look like. But you can see that central area, which happened to be at a slightly higher elevation than the edges of the roadway, the deterioration or the damage has followed a pretty good pattern. The pavement was in good condition before the flood happened, and it continues to be in a good condition. From a management perspective, there's not much to do. The pavement was not damaged and doesn't appear to be showing signs of damage. But if the western region, we noted that there is signs of deterioration. Now, what does this do? Well, this creates a pavement that is inherently prone to more damage. It inherently needs to be managed more, and we recognize that by looking at these deterioration pathways and hopefully recognizing proactively that more maintenance is needed before we get to the point where the road is completely failed. Because with pavements, when you take care of those pavements over time, they will perform longer. It's like your cars, right? When you change the oil, you change the tires. Doing those things help those cars last a lot longer, and we want to do that on our roadways. Many times, though, our visual clue of failure is too late. the pavement has already failed, and the resources needed are going to be significant. And those resources take away from other public services. They take away from our ability to invest in disaster planning and those sorts of activities. The final piece of this comes to strategic planning. Now, strategic planning is particularly problematic because it requires a very long foresight. It requires a lot of political will, because we're talking about strategically planning for 20, 30, 40 years away. I know a lot of the talks so far have been about what happens right after the event. But from an infrastructure standpoint, we build our infrastructure systems with centuries in mind. Many of our bridges in the United States are designed to last with 100-year or even longer sort of time horizons, because we know that it's a huge investment that we're making. We make it because it's important. Without those facilities, then we couldn't even have the ability to have a number of commercial activities and other things that fuel our countries and our societies. When we think about strategic planning, we need to think about three factors. Vulnerability, which has been talked about so far. This is where is the asset with respect to the hazard. From an engineering standpoint, not all roads are the same. And so we need to think about the engineering that went on behind that hazard, behind that asset. We also need to be thinking about the criticality. Which roads are important? Maybe the roads along evacuation routes are very, very important. The roads surrounding hospitals or food facilities or distribution facilities. Some assets are redundant, so maybe we can focus on assets that are non-redundant. At any point, whatever the metric is, when we think about strategically managing things, we need to think about their criticality. And then finally, we need to think about sensitivity. And I'll show you some examples of what each of these means. How do we actually go about thinking about vulnerability? And a lot of it is the same basic ideas that have been brought to so far. I'll start with one example of heat, and I'll start with that from Brazil. So this was some analysis we did several years ago. It basically maps critical pavement temperature. We select binders and materials by temperature for transportation assets. And the map on the left shows what does it look like today? What is the temperature profile for today? And these temperatures, by the way, are degrees Celsius. It's pavement temperature. The exact number doesn't matter. But what does really matter is the map on the right. And the map on the right says this is what steady temperature increases over time are likely to do to those temperature requirements. This, to the terminology that was used before, is the hazard. This is the climate change related hazard to our assets. Now that doesn't mean we've seen vulnerability. To see vulnerability, we really need to compare where are the assets. And so this is a map showing the publicly available data set of road network in Brazil. And you can see that that road network is highly concentrated on the eastern seaboard of the country. There are not many roads through the Amazon rainforest and the areas to the west. But this has implications, because by overlaying these two pieces, where is the hazard, where are the roadways, we can see which areas are particularly vulnerable to the role or the impact of steady temperature increases from the perspective of a roadway. And the graph on the right just shows some of the analysis. We define a vulnerability index, which basically relates number of roads to the temperature change that they're expected to have. And you can see that these things are concentrated with a lot of uncertainty, because climate change models are associated with a lot of uncertainty in various regions and cities and in divisions in the country. And I'll let you see that for a moment. But we can see clearly in the south and some of the north regions, the models suggest that there's a greater impact. I'll go to another example of vulnerability from the US. So here, again, we're talking about co-location of hazard and asset. And in this case, we're also looking at engineering standards. So it's no surprise that when we build large infrastructure systems, it takes decades and decades and decades to do that. And during that time, knowledge grows. We learn more. We learn what fails and what doesn't fail. And we're human beings. Engineers are human beings, believe it or not. Some people don't think that's the case, but we learn. So if we do something and it doesn't work, we do it differently. But what that creates is a system where not all pieces of infrastructure are designed to the same standards. And so when we think about vulnerability of engineering assets, we need to think about where the hazards are. We also need to think about the design standards prevailing at the time that an asset was created. So here we see precipitation, we see design standards for different assets, and then on the right, we've mapped where those vulnerabilities coincide. Where did the design standards happen to be under-designed given what likely precipitation changes are coming? Okay? So vulnerability is a piece. Criticality. So criticality is a more challenging issue. On the left, we have a map of my state, North Carolina, with what the agencies, this is largely a human-driven process. It can be objectively defined, but institutions like the Department of Transportation, institutions like Department of Safety, Human Health, Resilience, electricity, power, they come together and they looked and decided, where are our critical roads? Where are the locations that simply cannot fail during a disaster? And they've identified those. And the map, I know it's small, but the map highlights those routes. And not surprisingly, these are the interstates. These are the major roadways. On the right is an example of doing that criticality analysis for the country of India, using some geospatial betweenness analysis to see which roads actually link to the most other roads. And that's one way to identify criticality. But it has to be done in order to do the proper risk assessment. Finally, I'll show you what we mean by sensitivity. So sensitivity is about what is the condition. As engineers, we often like to think we put out an asset and it stays in good shape for the entire duration. But that's not the case. We have corrosion that affects our life. This picture in the middle here, I actually took that outside my apartment here in Brazil. It's actually, I'm a little bit afraid to walk over this because if you look, there's a really big hole underneath that. Now that's a sensitivity. That location, should flooding happen, would be more prone to damage because there's a weakness. There's an area for that to go into and weaken. And we have lots of examples of how assets are weakened and therefore sensitive to these hazards. Okay? All right, so to summarize, what do we take away from my talk? What I hope you take away. Climate change is likely to affect a number of stressors, and I don't think you need me to tell you, based on your own personal experiences, that heat and precipitation and water are affected by climate change. I think that's pretty well accepted, at least in this community. What I do want you to recognize is that when we talk about climate change, it's more than just flooded roads, and it's more than just buckling pavements. There are indirect implications of climate change on our transportation assets. This is becoming increasingly the case because of our reliance on cyber-based systems to control and command our transportation assets. And those systems' reliance on a number of power-based impacts, which are themselves affected by climate change. Management in the acute sense, is likely to increase because of extreme weather events, but we also need to think strategically about how do we prepare our systems so that we have to manage less during the disaster, or we can spend time really focusing on the human aspects of the disaster and not how do we get them out, or which roads are open to get them out of those hazards. Okay. With that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Shane. Again, it's quite impressive how things are connected, but not quite impressive. We arranged the presentations, and it's interesting the fact that as myself, Vipul, Nurmala, we were discussing the perspective of disaster management in the national perspective on how to develop the planning from a civil defense perspective. You brought the perspective from more civil engineering, from specific technologies related to the materials, to the asset management. And in fact, this is not a specific point that we see generally when we are discussing the disaster management in general. So, of course, climate change, it's something that the governments are bringing to the discussion, but not the effect of climate change in materials. They do discuss the climate change effect on the national planning, on how to improve the response to the floods, or how to improve the disaster response to landslide, but not to change the infrastructure or how to implement other materials in your specific case, but other infrastructure technologies for to be adaptable to the climate change in the future, to the changes that that we're going to face in the next 20, 50, 100 years, as you mentioned. And so it was a very interesting perspective, and that's the point that we have in the Ceped, the idea of bringing together the different engineerings together when we discuss disasters. So thank you very much again. Now we're going to move to the Q&A. So now I ask Marcos Montenegro to go to this specific section of the seminar. He will be moderating the question and answers. So Marcos, thank you.
Okay. Hi, hello, I am Marcos Montenegro. I'm a PhD student and a researcher here at Ceped Coppe. I will guide this Q&A session, and we're gonna alternate between questions from in-personal audience and the online ones on YouTube. So does anyone have any questions here? Okay. I'm going to start with the on-top questions. For Professor Tarcísio, Aline Freitas asks, sorry.
Marcos, I'm not listening to you very well. I don't know if you're holding the microphone in a different...
Okay. It's better?
Yeah.
Okay. 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 And Aline Freitas.
Now we're not hearing you anymore.
Yeah, what's going on? It's okay? I turned it off. No. Okay. Test one.
Yeah, we are listening.
Okay. Aline Freitas.
Again, I think that it's kind of coming...
Oscillating. Okay.
Yeah, oscillating.
Let me try another microphone. Now, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Aline Freitas, for Professor Tarcísio. Is there any partnership established between Cepeds in Rio de Janeiro, Fiocruz, UERJ, UFRJ, or with other Cepeds?
So thank you very much for your question, Aline. And no, we don't have at least a stronger collaboration between any Cepeds or among different Cepeds in Brazil. at least. As far as I know, I have discussed with the leaders of Cepeds here in Rio. I know that there were some initiative of creating those kind of collaborations, but it was more specifics. It happened just for specific projects and didn't last that long. So although it's quite interesting and a very important perspective to collaborate with other centers focused on the disaster research here in Rio de Janeiro or across different states in Brazil. I am not aware of specific collaborations, long-term collaborations, as you asked. But thank you for your question.
Okay, and for Professor Whipple, Paula Moraes asks, is the National Disaster Management System of India a mixed vertical and horizontal approach in its entirety? This is the first one.
Sir, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, for sure. Is the National Disaster Management System of India a mixed vertical and horizontal approach in its entirety?
Yes, sir. So, disaster management in India, it is actually mandated in the sense that it has a vertical flow in terms of having different authorities, which authority will report to whom, and also given a mandate of their jurisdictions, right? If it is a district level disaster, then district authority has an authority to act, react, and declare the disaster at the district level. If it goes beyond the district boundary, then the state disaster management authority come into picture. Um, and if the multiple states are affected, then National Disaster Management Authority have to play a crucial role. And similarly, in vertical sense or horizontal, like in parallel sense, uh, it is not only the one department that has given the mandate of doing disaster management activities. For example, if it is a ministry of like it is a revenue department under the Ministry of Home, then revenue department is definitely a nodal department to look after disaster preparedness and disaster response. However, other parallel departments such as health, education, or animal husbandry, or engineering, or public works department, or fire services department. So they are equally responsible to prepare their department level disaster management plans, prepare their teams for disaster response, and uh, and integrate disaster management actions into their departmental actions. Like from my experience, I have worked with different states. Like for example, I developed departmental disaster management plans of 15 departments of Andhra Pradesh state, right? So Andhra Pradesh is a state in South India, which actually took this particular action very seriously, where they directed each and every department, not only disaster management, but other departments like urban development, education, animal husbandry, railways, police, right, all the departments to develop their disaster management plan and implement at each and every up to the local level. Yes, so it is so disaster management by principle is integrated horizontally and vertically both the ways in India.
Okay, and Paula has two more questions. The first one is, second one in this case. In the integrative model of preparation, is there a mention of simulated exercises?
Yes, yes, definitely. So it is mandated for each and every department. The last chapter of each and every plan is like implementation of this plan, where they talk about periodic review and periodic simulation exercise, doing simulation exercise at various levels. So personally, I was involved in I am practically involved in several developing scenarios for conducting several simulation exercise, and my last experience of doing it for the municipal corporation, Cuttack Municipal Corporation in Odisha. And there is a concept of two mock drills in India basically. One is the normal mock drill, and one is mega mock drill. So mega mock drill is taken up by the states, right, at state level, where various municipal corporations and line departments, we call it line departments, who are the key actors in responding to disaster. So line departments and district and city municipal authorities, they they are given a state level scenario to act on, then they respond equally. To give you an example, in Gujarat state, where I'm currently located, they have last to last year they have done a mega mock drill for tsunami. So all the coastal districts of Gujarat state taken a part in that mega mock drill, and it was also partnered with Incois, who look after the early warning systems for tsunamis in India. Thank you.
And the last one, how is the testing and refinement of the India plan conducted?
Can you repeat, please, sir?
Yeah, for sure. She's asking about the monitoring of the India plan of this year, because this plan was enacted in 2019, right?
Okay, yes, yes, yes. The national level plan. So, okay. So, in India, plan updation is basically taken up taken up annually, and the cycles runs through the monsoon to monsoon season. So month of May and June is dedicated for all the departments to review their existing disaster management plans, because by 15th June, India start receiving monsoon from the South India, right? So states and within a month it reaches to the northern Indian parts. So the duration may vary. Like in the South Indian states, they already started receiving rains from now onwards. So they have already updated their plans and approved by the competent authorities. And in the northern states, they are in the process of updation of the plans.
Does anyone have any questions here? No? Okay, I'd like to ask for Professor Nirmala. We know that some countries face corruption, mainly in disaster management. So I'd like to ask about how can we improve accountability process in disaster management? Your opinion or your experience on this subject.
Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you for that. I think it starts from the premise of statutory and legislative processes. Disaster management obviously is one of the spheres or examples in which we could align it to a possibility of corruption emerging there. It would be the application of the legislative and statutory processes and looking at how this can be managed in terms of following due process. Due process in terms of disciplinary measures being taken to identify individuals who are the potential perpetrators in terms of abusing systems that could be related to disaster management. There could be two, if you're looking at corruption, I'm not too sure, it could be a bit ambiguous. Corruption in terms of a deliberately induced disaster. Are you referring to that? Or corruption in terms of managing the disaster? Which would it be? In terms of the managing. Okay, a very pertinent one would be COVID-19. So basically, in South Africa, there was a rampage of corruption relating to PPEs. From the establishment of makeshift businesses to the accordance of tenders to individuals that didn't really qualify because of collusion between government officials and service providers, to manipulating the public procurement process and the actual legislation, where if the amount surpassed, let's say, 50,000, it was supposed to be put out to a public tender. Now, in the case of an emergency, this you could bypass that kind of formal process and now use your prerogative as a public official to accord the tender because of an emergency situation. COVID-19 took us by surprise, and it was unfortunate only subsequent to the pandemic that all these issues of corruption emerged. But nevertheless, it goes back to yesterday's discussion. It was disclosed, but was there real political will? And aligned to that, the judicial will to take the requisite action in terms of disciplining those individuals from government officials to private service providers to ensure that a due process was followed. In most cases, those who were found wanting are still holding positions, and it places, if I could say, a lack of confidence or trust in the judicial system and politically aligned individuals who are supposedly supposed to rule in the interest of public good, but compromise this because of personal interest. And millions of rands were extorted out of public resources just because of personal greed and self-interest. So while we may say that we have legislative processes in place, we have a judicial system that's aligned to taking the necessary action, but is this in practice a reality that we are seeing the effect coming to fruition, where those who are supposed to be punished, are they really punished? Or are they, just because of the power that they hold, just bypassing the system? I think it's a very debatable. It's neither a yes nor a no question. Thank you.
There's another one from Cássio Maduro for Professor Vipol. How does disaster risk financing and insurance and risk transfer work in your country?
Thank you so much. This is a wonderful question on which we are also trying to work. So practically speaking, at national level, there is no such scheme that actually dedicatedly look at the aspects of disaster financing. But there are some initiatives taken by civil society organizations and also the state governments. To quote two examples from on which I personally worked on. One is there is an organization called as All India Disaster Mitigation Institute. This is the CSO with whom I worked for almost 4 years, right? And we coined Afat Vimo. Afat Vimo is a Gujarati term, or it is also similarly called in Hindi as well, language, and it is in English. It literal translate is disaster insurance. So we developed this insurance, and we implemented this in two states. One is, of course, Odisha, and one is Gujarat, where we tried to cover uh, street vendors, basically, who are much more vulnerable during disasters and who basically lose their livelihoods immediately after the disaster. And uh, we tried to basically cover the financial aspects during which, for the duration during which they lose their livelihood, right? So one is this, and another is the state of Goa, which is a very small state located on the west coast of India, and they implemented disaster insurance at a state level, right? And try to cover the basics, what we can say, all the state level population under this particular insurance. And partially, if you look in India, generally we cover the infrastructure aspects. Like if you see, if I coin this example of my city currently where I am working, it is international financial Gujarat Gift City, Gujarat International Finance Tech City. So this is the greenfield development and India's first operational smart city, and it is India's only IFSC, International Financial Services Center. So here we have very critical utilities, district cooling plant, automated waste collection system, STP sewage treatment plant, water treatment plant, and these are central locations. Though all the critical infrastructures within the plant are covered by insurance, and which also have included all the critical disasters, right? And disaster insurance in general, not as a disaster, but like for example, there are several uh, private agencies who are providing insurances, but those are pure private. Like it covers earthquake, floods, in general, act of God, right, for the housing properties. So if you take a loan to purchase a house, then that insurance is a mandate, which covers other disasters, fires, earthquake, floods, and cyclones. Right? And in people in public at large, they are mandated who have a license of holding a bike or a car. So they are mandated to have a 15 lakh insurance for road accident annually, right? So still in India, we do not have any centralized insurance mechanism to cover life of the people. So they are they are in bits and parts, right? But we do have uh, a system where majorly uh, relief payments are given to the deceased families or people who are affected by disaster. So those ex gratia payments are given by the government to all the people.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. It's 11:50, and any questions? No. Professor Tarcísio, I'll invite you to conclude this seminar.
Thank you very much, Marcos. So now we are reaching the final part of the seminar. So I would like first to invite Nirmala, Vipul, and Shane to share a very short message before we close, and then I'll do this closure. So maybe Vipul, if you could share some final words, what do you consider as future perspectives for collaboration, for research and project collaborations? We would like to hear a little bit from you. And then we move to Nirmala and Shane that are in the auditorium right now.
Thank you so much, sir. And once again, I'm very much thankful for providing this opportunity to joining the team. In terms of collaborative research, I think what I gathered from today's discussion is like we have many common areas to work on, right? So we are preparing mainly we are preparing for implementing Sendai framework at local level. And to do so, it is very important to align Sendai's priorities and our priorities together to achieve that common goal of minimizing the impact of disasters on human property and environment. Right, so I think this is the opportunity where we can work together, and definitely all the nations are working on different they are working on through different channels, through different departments, but they are working for a common goal to save the lives of the people. So in that framework, I would definitely try to contribute from my side, and I also gathered some field knowledge now, working with the community, working with the people, working on different field projects and researches that I can definitely contribute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vipul. Now we're going to auditorium.
Thank you, colleagues. I think there's innumerable opportunities in terms of pursuing research that's going to benefit not only the speakers from the various countries present here, but also to extend it, and I think more specifically, everyone's talking about the Brics, but not to denounce in any way the importance of the American input. But I think lots of it that we are talking about is from a government perspective, government responsibility. I would like to suggest some kind of research that's going to look at it from a social responsibility perspective and look at how individuals, the ordinary citizenry, can make a contribution in terms of, if I could say, contributing to enhanced best practices regarding disaster management processes and tools. I also found Shane's presentation quite impressive. Something that I think we need to focus on, especially in terms of transport and the management of that asset and the impact of climate change, which it has on transport asset management. I think a very pertinent issue, because most often, you find Shane had taken a picture of a hole. Normally, they will just drop in some soft tar and rub it over. That is temporary management. But in the long term, if one gets into more deep level mining, is that those temporary measures sustainable in the future? And especially from a material management perspective, are the materials that we are currently using conducive for long-term management and sustainability of such assets. It'll be an interesting area to focus on from a multi-geographical perspective. Thank you.
Now we're going to have Professor Shane.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll come here. Hopefully you can hear me okay online. I guess in closing, I would just like to say I appreciate the chance to come and talk today. Definitely a different audience than I'm usually talking to, but very, very informative. I guess I'd like for the group to appreciate the technical role. So we think about our systems as social technical systems and the interaction there. And then the role that maybe proactively thinking about how we create our infrastructure to assist or maybe to reduce the negative influences of the hazard. I think, Vipul, you mentioned a disaster as a human endeavor and a conflagration of human issues with natural hazards. And I think planning and long-term strategically thinking about our infrastructure, that's something that we as civil engineers argue for everywhere, and I think there's a place for that here too. And then just to say thank you for the opportunity to talk today.
Thank you, everyone. And my final message is that today we saw strong similarities in disaster management structure and challenges faced by some Brics countries. Now, today we had the Professor Nirmala and Vipul from South Africa and India. And I agree with Professor Nirmala that today we had a strong perspective from the government actions, but in Ceped, Coppe, for instance, we have several research projects and initiatives that are focused on the relationship between government and private sector, government and civil society, and also private sector and civil society in general. So I agree with you with the need to bring those stakeholders together. It's something that we are really focused on. And I hope we can continue to develop research and practical contributions in the topic in our countries, but I also hope that we could start developing new research projects exploring the expertise that we all here shared today, and also together with other researchers and professionals interested in joining us in future initiatives. So again, I would like to thank everyone who attended this conference in person or online, the speakers, and especially the Ceped Coppe researchers who contributed to making the seminar happen. So see you all in the Ceped Coppe social media, Instagram, Facebook, Ceped Coppe UFRJ, and scientific conference and the next seminar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.